Hi. So, Sonder Studios is coming back online. I kind of thought about this for a while, but hesitated to actually do it because I've kind of been avoiding getting in front of the camera, thinking it has to be perfect. But I have 19 subscribers, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Who am I trying to impress? So, uh, I'm going to start a new series. The basic gist of it is I'm just going to be talking hopefully once every few days, but at the very least once a week, about books, RPGs, the creative process, writing, acting, pretty much anything that catches my attention. Um, I know this won't be everyone's cup of tea, but if you're like me and you like to put on YouTube videos while you work out, just kind of listen to someone talk, this might be for you. In particular, I highly recommend the Spoonie experiment up until he went silent for, no one really knows why. There's a great Down the Rabbit Hole video on that if anyone's interested. Interesting guy to listen to, but he has his own history, and for whatever reason, he isn't uploading anymore. But he better, because I'm going to take his niche if he doesn't. So, anyway, today I kind of want to talk about this new RPG I found, Stars Without Number. I actually have known about it for a while, but I've only recently gotten back into it. This is kind of inspired by a video on Reddit about the top 10 systems that aren't Dungeons and Dragons for tabletop roleplaying. It's something I love. Before I start and get into it, I should introduce Vigo, my new roommate. He's in the Randall's Real Review series. He's a rising star as an actor. He's got a bright future. I think he's napping right now, though. At any rate, Stars Without Number is this open world RPG, and it's actually pretty rules light. For the most part, all of your rolls are going to be 2d6. That's what the skill checks are. I believe there are AC, which is on d20, but for the most part, it's 2d6. And if you're wondering, oh, well, why don't you just use a modded 5e for that sort of system? Well, that's valid. 5e is very well balanced and all that. But what I think makes Stars Without Number so special is just how bare bones it is. And you might say, bare bones? Well, look at this. It is thick. What's interesting is most of this is not dedicated to rules. The rules are pretty basic, and the characters are pretty basic. I believe there are 3 classes. It's kind of like specialist, warrior, psychic. And it really doesn't get much more complicated than that. The rest of it is about these outlines for all these types of sci-fi worlds and economies and societies. What I think is super interesting about that is that sci-fi settings tend to require kind of a lot of attention to detail. It's supposed to be something that obeys our laws of physics at least a little, and you don't really have the standard fantasy excuse of it's magic, I don't have to explain shit. So, with sci-fi, there's usually this tremendous burden of world building that ends up on the DM's plate. And that can be pretty intimidating. A lot of settings that I love, like Shadowrun or Numenera, which are back there, solve this by giving you lots of lore to work with that's already prescribed, and there are setting books you can buy and in-game magazines. But in my opinion, that ruins a lot of the fun of DMing, which is almost mostly the enjoyability of making a world and making it your own, whereas the fun of being a player is kind of being an actor in that imaginary space. And so what Stars Without Number does an excellent job of, even if it's kind of lacking in rules and honestly just substance, is giving you tools to make your own sci-fi worlds. That's awesome. I don't know about you, but that's some of my favorite shit. So there's a whole section on here, for example, on post-scarcity societies, which is something I've never really seen in fiction except maybe Star Trek. where humanity has gotten to the point where resources are no longer an issue for anyone. Everyone has enough. It's just an age of ultimate plenty. There's no poverty, and there's no even real meaningful stratification of wealth. Communism for the win. And the way these post-scarcity societies work in Stars Without Number are with a system called face, which is kind of like reputation. And I think that's super interesting because it essentially says that, well, if currency and resources are no longer a problem, what will replace that? What will people strive for? And it turns out, recognition and like positive social reinforcement is never really going to go away. And that kind of makes sense. Like, even if you aren't worried about food, even if everyone's living in a mansion, you still probably want to be well liked. And so the currency in those post-scarcity societies is face, which is kind of like vaguely based off of this Shinto, like Japanese, I think, concept of like reputation, and it kind of means honor in that context, but in this case it's more like popularity and how liked you are. And that's the reward for like completing missions in those societies. And it's just super interesting. You can get like super high-tech stuff in exchange for face, obviously, because whatever society is post-scarcity is going to be pretty advanced. What makes it a little more complicated is I think it's kind of hard to throw those post-scarcity societies in with a rest of a universe that is not like post-scarcity, because you'd think they would then share it with everyone and everyone would operate on this non-economic economy. I don't know. It meshes a little weird if you're not running a whole game world based on that. But it's a super cool idea, and I haven't seen it explored before. There are also so many goddamn tables. These are just for names. And I know it's probably the nerdiest shit ever to be genuinely excited by tables, but look at this. Look at this. It's these are one-roll NPCs. One-roll patrons. The basic idea of the whole, maybe back 3/4 of this book, is just to give you lots of options and to kind of spur your creativity through randomness. So you can roll, for example, for like what type of government a planet has, what its biosphere looks like, what its terrain looks like, what its atmosphere looks like. All these little details that help a lot for world building, but which are kind of a pain in the butt to come up with on your own. And more than that, when you roll these, or even if you just pick from the table, you end up with a confluence of traits that maybe aren't stereotypical, right? You don't end up with another rugged desert planet with savage nomads on it. Dune is awesome, but you sometimes want to play through something different. And when it comes to like breaking cliches and tropes, there's nothing much better than randomness. So I rolled randomly for a planet when I was trying to start a campaign in Stars Without Number. And what I actually came up with was this Asian Indian Raj hierarchy with these elements of like kind of Malthusian cannibalism, where like if you happen to be the one who goes over the population count, you get recycled. It ended up being a very odd and kind of brutal civilization that I definitely would never have thought of on my own, but with the resources in Stars Without Number, it kind of just sprang out of nowhere and from my dice. So I would recommend picking this up. You might notice that I just have printouts here. I would buy it myself if I could find a way to, buy it in an actual bookstore. I have a whole thing about wanting to support both bookstores and the actual developers, and I just haven't been able to find it anywhere physically. That's one of the downsides, I think, of choosing kind of an obscure system is, Barnes & Noble is not going to be selling it. But it's a super fun system, and it doesn't take too long to get players set up. They kind of just choose a bunch of archetypes and fill those out into these character sheets that are a little more complicated than 5e, but they look more intimidating than they actually are. Like there are a lot of boxes for skills, and you don't really need to use all of them. And any given character will probably only be good at a handful of those. I guess I should probably talk about like the dice rolling mechanics real quick for people who are interested in that. For the most part, like I said, it's just 2d6, and most things it specifies that almost most actions that you would be able to do if you are a competent person would not require a roll. You're not going to need a roll to, I don't know, put your shoulder against a door. You might need a roll to like break it down if it's reinforced, but most normal actions won't require any roll at all, which is kind of balanced out by the fact that skill points are hard to get. You start out with a default -1 in any given skill, and the first point you put into it just puts you at a +0, meaning that your roll just doesn't get modified as compared to the target, which is kind of, it feels underpowered, but it results in a system with more meaningful numbers. One of the big gripes I have about systems like Pathfinder, even though I love it, is that the bonuses get so high and so crazy that it kind of becomes irrelevant what you actually roll. And Stars Without Number fixes that by keeping them relatively small. So a moderate challenge would be you have to roll a 6. 2d6 can obviously either hit 2 to 12, with 7 being the average. So you're there's slightly more than 50% chance you're going to hit this like average skill check. Then they go from like 6 to 8 to 10 in terms of difficulty. I believe there's 12 too, but that is kind of, I think, just the DM's way of saying you really shouldn't be trying to do that. Yeah, it's a great system. It's a little clunky, and I'm not sure how I feel about the whole psychic system, which is their version of magic. It fits really well thematically with sci-fi. Think like XCOM, like with psychic soldiers. It just seems to make more sense with sci-fi than straight up magic. The whole idea of like the power of the mind in an otherwise indifferent physical universe thematically makes a lot of sense. That being said, some of these psychic powers are busted as fuck. Like there's this one that I think it's only like a 3rd level cast or something along those lines, where you can regenerate even from like giblets. It's nuts. You're functionally immortal. But there's nothing wrong with letting players get OP. It leads to that kind of Monty Cook problem, like with Numenera or D&D 3E, where the casters get exponentially more powerful, and the fighters and the rogues are just kind of sitting there with their thumbs up their butts. Because yeah, sure, they can maybe deal 3d10 damage to the bad guy, but they also can't stop time. They can't use the Warudo, which is problematic in terms of game balance. But then again, there can be this valid trade-off where wizards are super weak in the beginning, and Stars Without Number kind of does this. There's also a ship combat system, which I like more than Starfinder's, as good as I think that system is. It's just less jank. And it fits in well with the economy they establish, where ships are pretty expensive, but they're like good kind of mission rewards. You can scavenge parts off of other ships. It's cool. Let's see, what else? I don't know. There are other unique mechanics. I might actually make a part 2 after I reread this more thoroughly, because I've only like kind of skimmed this. Last I read it was last year. And in preparation for this new game. Maybe in the last few minutes of the video, because I think this is getting a little long, I'll talk about my last session with Stars Without Number. So it went pretty well. It was with only a handful of friends, which is a little low for my groups. I usually run with 8 or 9, which maybe is too chaotic, but debatable. Anyway, I started them out in a really dire situation. They were essentially going to have their organs harvested. I left them, naked, chained up against the wall. There were 2 other guys next to them. One of them died horribly to establish the stakes narratively. Blood everywhere, fleshy organs being torn out and put into neat little cases by ominous dudes with gas masks turns out the reason they had gas masks is because the chambers were periodically flooded with sedative, um, which was understandably used to like put these organ vats back out of consciousness to kind of be a little more humane about it, although that wasn't a primary concern of these organ harvester assholes. Anyway, through a series of lucky rolls, they did manage to get out. I set it fairly low, but this one poor guy, we'll call him Jay, I guess, kept rolling twos. And it took him ages to get out of his restraints, to the point where I think one of them almost blacked out while the other was trying to free him. They took some scalpels, stabbed a bunch of guards, and one of them, we'll call him G, I guess, started running down the hallway looking for weapons or just any way to arm himself. Eventually, he used like these environmental cues and also kind of eavesdropping on people in the mess hall to find out where the armory was. I fudged it a little to help him, I'll admit, but he ended up in a room with all these pretty high-tech weapons, because that's what the organ harvesters would have. They wouldn't keep it locked behind a boss. They keep it in the armory. Not to make a whole point of realism over good mechanics, but anyway, there ended up being this very tense, cramped, bloody firefight in this corridor of this dark black steel ship with overhead fluorescent lights that were being shattered by the bullets. Very cool image with people kind of leaning out into the hall to shoot and using carts of medical equipment and organs as cover. It was a good fight. A few people ended up almost dying on our side, but they ended up depressurizing the hall. We also had around like a 40-minute argument on how it would take a skill check to throw a grenade between two guys' heads, over their shoulders from around 20 feet away. The argument the players were making, obviously, is that it wouldn't be that hard. I thought it was a narrow doorway. These guys are shooting at you at the time. It's hard to throw a grenade past them, especially because they're bulky guys and it's a narrow doorway. Whatever. It took quite a while to resolve that. But once we did, the grenade blew a hole in the ship and sucked out a lot of people. We, I think, had the loss of all the NPCs I meant to have them be allied with, just from bleeding out and then also being sucked out of the ship. They eventually managed to stop the depressurization with very elastic canvas and power tools. I don't know if that would actually work, but it was a creative solution, so it worked. And they rolled well, too. The session kind of didn't continue after that. We ended up going back to our main Numenera game and just never got back around to Stars Without Number, which I think is a shame because honestly I prepped a lot of worlds for it. I think anyone interested in tabletop RPGs, especially in open world, kind of the world is your oyster exploration RPGs, will probably really like Stars Without Number. It's a little bit jank, and it's closer to AD&D than 5e, in that its systems are a little flat and not super refined. But it's a super flexible system, and it's great for kind of making your own stuff, but with the guidance of randomness, which I think is super cool. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to my ramblings, and I'll try to be back again soon to talk more about RPGs or who knows.